Robbins. In this video we're going to go over our 6 different types of life. So when we were still at school, we got together and we were talking a little bit about Aristotle, who, if you remember, was the father of taxonomy. So he was one of the first people who started thinking about there being differences in types of life. You know, maybe plants and animals and fungus, maybe we're not all the same. So he was the first person to start separating them into different categories. But he kind of got stuck because there were certain categories of life that he wasn't able to see with his very own eyes. And it would take a very, very long time before people were able to see those types of life. So as we were talking about, Van Leeuwenhoek was the first person to see what he called animalcules through his microscope in about, I think it was 1650. And even then, just because he saw them doesn't mean that he really understood exactly what he was seeing. So it took even longer for people to really break this apart and figure out what they were looking at. But now we're here in 2020, and we have our list of the 6 different types of life. I'm going to tell you something. These different types of life are actually called kingdoms. And when I say kingdoms, I don't mean like Sir Ector's kingdom or, Gilgamesh's kingdom or anything like that, but they're kingdoms of life. So, just like we had said before, we have animals, plants, fungus, protista, eubacteria, and archaeobacteria. Just as a review, I have my trusty computer here today to show you some examples of these kingdoms. So hopefully you can see this okay, but right here we have a bunch of different animals. So as you can see inside here, there are tons of different types of animals that exist inside the kingdom of animal. Some of them are things like butterflies that look completely different from things like polar bears or quails or lizards or humans even. We're all inside the animal category, the animal kingdom. Another example of things that live in the animal kingdom are spiders and snails and worms and different kinds of corals and sea slugs. And we'll talk about those types of life later, but just an example. In the plant kingdom, here again, you see that there's many different types of life inside the plant kingdom. You can see that there's fruits and vegetables, there's conifers like our evergreens that grow outside of our school, there's things like ferns and mosses. So all those different types of plants can all fit in the same kingdom. There's a huge, huge variety. And we also have fungi. And again, there can be all different types of mushrooms and fungus all around us. They look all different. Another thing that you might not have realized, but yeast is also in the fungi kingdom. And you might not know this, but yeast, we interact with yeast every day. As long as you're not gluten-free, you're going to be eating that type of life in your bread. It is a very useful organism. Then we have protists. Protists are kind of confusing. They are a very random assortment of life. They can be pretty big. They can also be pretty small. What we like to call this kingdom of life is sort of like the junk drawer of life. So if it's not a plant, animal, or fungus, then it might be a protist. We'll talk a little bit more about how to categorize a protist, but for now, just sort of think about it in some ways as the bizarre versions of plants, animals, and fungus. Then at the bottom of our list, we have Archaea bacteria and Eubacteria. As you can see, these two different kingdoms look almost exactly the same. And if you're not looking close enough to the computer, you might not be able to see exactly the labels on those, and you might get them totally confused. I would get them confused. But over here you have Archaea bacteria, and here you have Eubacteria. The big difference between these two types of life is that the Eubacteria is one of the biggest kingdoms. It has life that lives everywhere. It is all over everything. It's inside of us, it's on the things that we touch every day, and they are microscopic organisms that are just part of the world everywhere. But the Archaea bacteria is known as something called an extremophile. So most of the organisms in the Archaea bacteria are going to be things that live in very extreme environments. So they might live in glaciers. They might live in geysers. They might live in really, really salty places like the Dead Sea. They also might live in really nasty sulfur, hot volcano cracks in the earth. Those are places where it's really hard for any other organism to live in, and you wouldn't really expect there to be any organisms living in there. But the Archaea bacteria typically really like that, and that's a good way to distinguish them. Another thing is that the Archaea bacteria is believed to be some of the most ancient types of life form. So, now that we've had a little bit of a review of those types of animals, you will be ready to watch the next video on how we separate those animals into further categories. I shouldn't even say animals. Bad habit of mine. Say that they're kingdoms of life. They are all different living organisms.